All right, greetings everyone. A warm welcome to everyone who has joined us here in Zoom or online, wherever you are, Facebook or YouTube. A warm welcome to everyone to the Truth Seeker Summits. And thank you for taking your time out of your busy schedule to join us today. My name is Sarah Buckland, representing Chosen to Glow Ministries. I just realized my camera was not on. But yes, I will be your host for today. Today is the third of our 9-part series on the theme Christianity, Conspiracy, Colonial, or Compelling. Today, we will be discussing the specific topic, can we trust the Bible? And we will be exploring evidence for the New Testament. Now, this is an important issue because our entire faith and hope as Christians is based on the truthfulness of the New Testament in terms of it being reliable, retelling history in the places and people it describes, and reliable in terms of how it has been transmitted to us today. So we want to explore tonight, is there any evidence that it is beyond human origin? So to lead us tonight in this discussion of these important questions, we have two very special speakers, Dr. Callum Miller and Dr. Max Baker Hitch, both research associates. One is from Oxford University and the other is from Wycliffe Hall. We thank you both for joining us, for taking your time out of your busy schedule to join us. So before we go any further, I believe yes, he's online. So we'll ask Pastor Joseph Buckland to lead us with an opening prayer.
Good evening, everyone. Let us go to God in prayer. We give you thanks, Lord, for this evening, for the opportunity that we have to learn about the reliability of the New Testament. We give you thanks for our guest speakers who have joined us from the United Kingdom. We pray you may bring back to their minds all that they have studied in preparation for this Truth Seekers Summit. We pray that you'll open our hearts to receive whatever truth we will be discovering tonight. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.
Amen. All right. So right before we go into this evening's discussion, we have an exciting announcement to make. As most of you would know, our second Youth for Truth Challenge continued last week. And although the week started slowly, we not only have a winner this week, but we have two honorable mentions. So just to remind you, this week's question was, how do we know that the Bible does not endorse racism? Our winner for this week, and I will share my screen, drum roll. Our winner this week is Miss Danielle Olivia for the second week in a row, and I would love you'll hear her
know
presentation.
that the Bible does not endorse racism because the first book in the Bible tells us that the entire human race is made in God's image, Genesis 1:27. And even though we don't all look the same, we all have been created in the likeness and essence of our Creator. Furthermore, Revelation 7:9 states that people from every tribe and every nation of the earth will stand in front of God's throne before the Lamb.
Wow, we'd like to congratulate Danielle. Danielle won for herself two different prizes. One is courtesy of the Institute of Creation Research, volume 3 of their DVD, What is Man? And we also have given or will be giving Danielle an apologetics evangelism pack, two-tone twins showing us our common origins of all races and also the truth about Jesus. So congrats, Danielle. But as I mentioned, we have two honorable mentions as well, which we will be playing. We had Joanna Sahadeo from all the way from Trinidad, who sent in a very good entry, as well as Nicholas Golding. And they also won for themselves another prize, Christianity for Skeptics.
The Bible does not endorse racism. In God, there is no Jew or Gentile. All races have descended from Adam and Eve. We are all one blood. God just chose the Jews to come through, but all races have been grafted in. The Lord may prohibit covenants between cultures or unbelievers and believers, but never due to race or skin color. Perhaps the clashes between cultures are not skin color. Rather, I would say evolution promotes race superiority due to the evolution process, but never Christianity. We are all different shades of brown, aren't we?
Aren't we? Yes. All right, and Nicholas Golding.
Good morning, my brothers and sisters. The Bible does not support racism. If we should look in Romans chapter 10, verse 12, we see that it says specifically that there is no distinction between Jew and Greek, because everyone that calls on the name of God shall be saved. And this shows that the Bible does not support racism. God loves everyone equally, no matter where you're from. Also, if we should look in Acts chapter 10, verse 34 and 35, it shows that God showed no partiality, but as long as we do His will, He will accept us. So God loves everyone equally, and we should do His will, and we will be rewarded also equally. We are all loved on the same level. Thank you for listening.
All right. Again, I'd like to extend, Chosen to Glow Ministries would like to extend hearty congratulations to all our winners this week. They are all one step closer to be eligible for grand prizes, which include gift certificates from Christian Book, Recharge Lifestyle, and a museum tour. All right, so we'd encourage you, if you have not tried to enter, we encourage you to attempt. It is also helping you to reinforce the ideas that we are, the topics we are presenting to you over the weeks. All right.
The Bible does not endorse cultures.
All right, now let's go into the meat of this week's matter. For those who are joining us late this evening, our topic this week is, can we trust the Bible? Exploring the New Testament. Our first speaker is Dr. Callum Miller. And Dr. Callum Miller is a medical doctor and research associate at the University of Oxford, United Kingdom. He has given over 40 academic presentations internationally and taken part in debates against senior academics. He has published in a number of top academic venues and received prizes from the University of Oxford and the Royal College of Psychiatrists for his work on bioethics. He has spoken all over the world, including on the BBC and the White House. So thank you, Dr. Miller, for taking your time to join us. I know that it is 6 hours ahead where you are, and so it's about midnight. So thank you for taking the time, and the floor is now yours.
You're very welcome. Thank you. And thank you to everyone who's taken the time to tune in. This is obviously a crucially important topic. If you're a Christian, it's incredibly important because the Bible teaches that if Christ is not risen, then your faith is futile. And of course, our faith is grounded on history. If you're not a Christian or if you're doubting, then this is also a crucial topic, because one of the central claims of Christianity is that God became a human in history. And that's something that we have to explore and come to a decision on. Everyone has to wrestle with this question of, who was Jesus, the historical person in time and space? What was he really like? Who was he? What did he do? And ultimately, was he right when he claimed to be God, when he claimed to be able to save people from their sins, when he claimed to be the center point of world history? So Max and I are going to be talking today about this incredibly important topic from the perspective of the general reliability of the New Testament. Obviously, this has been challenged a lot around the world for actually quite a few centuries now. There's been significant numbers of scholars who have been doubting this. But actually, having worked in this area, I did a master's in the kind of biblical history and reliability of the Bible, and have done a lot of work on it. Max and I have written a book on this, in fact. And the more I've come to study it, the more I've come to realize that it really is a set of historical documents which are historically trustworthy and a firm foundation for the claims that they make. So we could have the next slide, please. Great. So you may well have come across skeptics in the newspapers, in the media, on social media, Christopher Hitchens was a particularly famous one who said that the contradictions and illiteracies of the New Testament have filled up books by eminent scholars and have never been explained by any Christian authority, except in the feeblest terms of metaphor and a Christ of faith. What he's saying is that Christians, when they're challenged by these skeptics, retreat to just saying it's a metaphor, the stories about Jesus in the New Testament. Michel Onfray, one of the foremost atheists in France, says, he goes further, he says Jesus's existence has not been historically established. No contemporary documentation of the event, no archaeological proof, nothing certain exists today. Well, the reality in the academic world is very different. It's quite clear that these people have not really engaged with historical scholarship. I'm not talking about theology. I'm not talking about what your pastor might teach, although I'm sure it's excellent, the material that your pastor teaches. I'm talking about the academic historians who have studied this at an academic level and in terms of secular history. In fact, there's a real consensus that we can know a lot about Jesus, even among the most liberal or skeptical scholars. So E.P. Sanders is not a conservative Christian. He thinks that the Bible has errors, and he is skeptical about certain parts of the New Testament. He's not committed to inerrancy or the belief in the entire Bible as being perfectly historically accurate. So he's a good example of someone who is a skeptical scholar who nevertheless shows that the consensus is actually quite significant. So whatever your religious view, the historical consensus is that there are no substantial doubts about the general course of Jesus's life, when and where he lived, when and where he died, and the sort of thing he did during his public activity. Next slide, please. So I won't read all of this out. It breaks the number one rule of slideshows to have this much text on a slide. I'm just going to summarize it. He says these are the things that pretty much all scholars agree on, whatever their religious belief, whether they have a religious belief or they're an atheist or whatever. Every historian has agreed that Jesus was born around 4 BC, that he was crucified under Pontius Pilate, that he taught about the kingdom of God, that he performed what seemed to be miracles, and so on. But there's a question we have to ask first, which is, how do we know whether the Bible that's been handed down to us is the same as the Bible originally written? Well, the way that scholars look at this question is to look at the number of manuscripts, to look at how early those manuscripts are, and to see just how well they correspond with each other. What many people don't realize is that actually for most historical works, we have very, very few manuscripts at all. So Tacitus was the foremost historian in ancient Rome, and he was the person from whom we get so much of our knowledge of Roman history. Now, for his main book on Roman history, we have only 2 manuscripts from history, and those 2 are not complete. One of them covers a few books of his work, and the other covers another few books of his work. We don't even have his entire work on Roman history. And this is one of the leading historians of ancient Rome, from whom we get most of our, or a very large amount of our knowledge. By contrast, when you look at the manuscripts for the New Testament, we have 4 complete copies, which is the entire New Testament. Now, that doesn't sound like very many, but compared to most ancient works of its size, that's still a significant number. But actually, we have hundreds of partial copies. And when I say partial copies, I don't mean, a fragment here and there. I mean potentially all 4 Gospels or all of Paul's letters. These are really quite significant manuscripts that give a lot of the New Testament, and we have hundreds of them compared to just 2 partial manuscripts from Tacitus. And then when it comes to fragments, where we can look at individual verses or a few verses, we have literally thousands compared to very few, often none, of any other works. So the New Testament really actually stands up to scrutiny very well in this respect. Scholars are very confident that we know what the original New Testament said, because it far outstrips any other ancient work in terms of the manuscript evidence available for it. The other element of this is how early the manuscripts are. So in the case of Tacitus's manuscripts, they come from the 9th century and I think the 11th century. And that's about 1,000 years after Tacitus. And those are the earliest manuscripts we have. By contrast, when it comes to the New Testament, we have a very large number of manuscripts from within a few centuries, and the earliest is from around 100, 120 AD. Max might correct me if that's slightly off, but the New Testament manuscripts we have are incredibly early compared to in other works of ancient history. We also know that the writers of the New Testament wrote in a very short time after Jesus. Sometimes our biographies of ancient figures like Alexander the Great come from at least 100 years later. The earliest source we have for Alexander the Great is actually 120 years after he existed. By contrast, the earliest source for Jesus is within 20 years of his existence. And so on every measure, the New Testament actually stands up to considerable scrutiny when looking at the manuscript evidence we have. And that's why scholars are so confident that we know pretty much exactly what the New Testament authors actually wrote. But of course, that doesn't show us that what the New Testament authors wrote was true. Maybe they got it wrong in the first place. And so Max and I are going to cover a framework for thinking about this. And the framework goes like this. We're going to first look at the world of the New Testament. And by that, I mean the places in the New Testament, the customs of the New Testament, the politics of the New Testament, the general setting. And we're going to show that external sources from archaeology and from other written historians back up what the New Testament says. But of course, you can have a real world setting, and have completely made up characters. In the books of Harry Potter, they sometimes use real places and they sometimes refer to real customs, but the characters are clearly still completely made up. So we're then going to look at the characters of the New Testament to see how well they are verified by the other evidence from history. But then, of course, you can have real world and real characters, and you could completely make up the events. This is less common in history, but it does occasionally happen in some works of fiction. And so we're then going to go further in detail and show that the events likewise are backed up by external sources. And so we're going to use this framework. I'm going to be talking about the places and the customs, and then Max a little later will be talking about the characters of the New Testament and the events. So in terms of the places, when you look at the kind of critical and skeptical New Testament scholarship, the academic historians who are critical of what the New Testament says, one thing they've often said is that the Gospel of John is particularly unreliable, because they say the Gospel of John was written later. They say that the Gospel of John is unlike the other Gospels and seems to be based around metaphor, and it has a lot of complex theology and an in-depth kind of theological speeches. And this is a sign that the Gospel of John is late and historically unreliable. So we're going to focus on John because it's apparently the least reliable. And we're going to show that actually the places in John have all been verified by archaeology. And you can actually visit almost all of them to this day. And Max and I actually have done so. So about 100 years ago, the pool of Bethesda, mentioned in John chapter 5, was thought to be a complete metaphor. John says, in Jerusalem by the sheep gate, there is a pool called Bethesda, which has 5 porticos, and a portico is a kind of arch. And Jesus performed a healing there. And because they hadn't found the pool of Bethesda, this one particular scholar from 100 years ago says that the pool was just a symbol of Judaism, and the 5 arches were an allusion to the 5 books of the law, the first 5 books of the Bible. It was all a metaphor. Well, the problem with this is that about 50 years later, archaeologists actually found the pool of Bethesda and realized it was a real place. This is a photo that Max and I took just a couple of years ago. This is the pool of Bethesda from the 1st century. We know not only that it is the same pool, but we also know that it had a dividing line down the middle, which would have given it a 5th arch. And beforehand, scholars were puzzled about why the pool would have 5 arches when pools in the time normally had 4. It's because there was an arch in the middle that archaeology has shown very likely existed. And so that's just one example of how archaeology continually demonstrates the reliability of the Bible. For a next example, we're going to turn to northern Israel, in Capernaum in Galilee, where Jesus lived for several years. This was never in significant disputes, but if you go today, you can really see quite a lot of impressive remains. We see here in these pictures at the top in the middle is the foundations of the first century synagogue that Jesus preached at. On the top right is a fishing boat from the first century. Remarkably, despite being made of wood, it survived because it was essentially coated in mud for 2,000 years. And it was so big that it could hold potentially 15 people. Now, beforehand, some people were skeptical of the stories in the Bible saying that there were all the disciples on Jesus's boat because boats wouldn't be that big on a fishing lake in Galilee. But this shows that in the first century, they had ordinary fishing boats which could hold up to that many people. The bottom right is a general picture of Capernaum showing kind of the layout of the village. It's only a small part of it, but you see a whole lot of houses essentially. But most remarkably, what we have on the bottom left is actually the house of Simon Peter. And this seems like the kind of thing pilgrims might make up many centuries later. And if you go to Israel, you will find some things that pilgrims made up several centuries later. And that's not a surprise, and it's not something that challenges the Christian faith. But what's most remarkable is that there's actually a consensus among archaeologists that this really was Simon Peter's house. Most archaeologists believe that that is the case. They know that it was used as a house church in the first century within just a few decades of Jesus' lifetime. They know that it had fishing hooks on the floor, which would make sense given Peter's occupation as a fisherman. And we know that it was used as a church for many centuries afterwards. And so this is a really significant finding that, as I say, most scholars are really convinced this is Peter's house. One other thing relating to this is that the house was found to have very thin walls, and the only type of roof that the house would have been able to support is a thatched roof. And this is interesting because in the Gospel of Mark, it actually says that people brought their friend to Jesus to heal him, and they lowered him through the roof of the house. Now, this would be impossible if the house was made of stone, but because the house was most likely a house with a thatched roof, this completely fits with the story in Mark of the healing that happened through the man being lowered through the roof. So there's a lot of interesting stuff in Capernaum. For our next example, we're talking about Nazareth. Nazareth sometimes is claimed to have never existed. This website, Jesus Never Existed, as you might expect, is also quite skeptical about Nazareth. It says Nazareth isn't mentioned in the Old Testament. It's not mentioned in the early Jewish literature. St. Paul never mentions Nazareth. In fact, no historian or geographer mentions Nazareth. And they say this wouldn't matter. The fact that no one mentions it in ancient times wouldn't matter if we actually had ruins from Nazareth, but no such ruins exist. Well, the problem again here is that we do have ruins. And last time someone actually sent this quote to me, I was actually in Nazareth, looking in front, looking at the ruins. So this is some of the stuff that's there. What you can see on the left is actually something that some people have argued is Jesus's house. Now, I won't get into the detail of why that is now, and it is inevitably a little bit conjectural and speculative. I'm not going to be overly credulous and just say, of course, this is Jesus's house, but it has been a thesis advanced by some archaeologists that this is likely the house that Jesus lived in Nazareth, and it certainly dates to the first century. Beneath, you find a first century tomb, and you can see the rolling stone still there. This is exactly the sort of rolling stone that might have sealed Jesus's tomb, as is very familiar from the Easter stories. On the top is I think that's a watchtower, and Jesus tells a parable about a watchtower, and some scholars have speculated that he got this imagery from his hometown of Nazareth as well. Again, that's a little bit speculative, but we have found remains of a watchtower. This is a reconstruction, but the real remains do exist elsewhere. Samaria is another place in John's Gospel that we know very well. These are photos that Max and I took a few years ago. In John's Gospel, chapter 4, Jesus has a conversation with a Samaritan woman at a town called Sychar. We know the town called Sychar, and he had a conversation at a particular well. Now, quite remarkably, you might think we would easily find places like Jerusalem or Samaria because they're big places and they're well-known places. You might think it very unlikely we'd be able to locate a first century well in Samaria near this town. But in fact, we have done so. And this is from the first century, this well in Samaria. And you can go and visit it again today. Next slide, please. Finally, there's many more examples that we could give. There's a chapter in one of the leading books on archaeology about all the places in John's Gospel, and it goes through every single place mentioned in John's Gospel and says that we've identified, I think, all of them except one by this point, and that's out of about 25 or so. So that's pretty good going, given that most archaeology turns to ruins and turns to rubble and is never seen again. What I find most remarkable is that we also likely know where Jesus's tomb was. Now, because this is a religious site and because it attracts lots of tourists, it's easy to imagine that this might have been made up many centuries later. But for various reasons, many scholars are actually convinced that this is indeed where Jesus was buried. That's partly because the description of Jesus's burial is pretty complete in the Gospel of John. It says it was in a garden. Luke says that it was in a tomb cut from rock, and so on. And archaeologists have discovered that there was a garden in the vicinity, the tomb was cut from rock, and so on. But perhaps the most compelling piece of evidence out of many other pieces of evidence that this is Jesus's tomb is where it's located. So at the time that this tomb was cut, it lay outside the city walls. But just 10 years later, the city walls were expanded so that the tomb was included inside it. Now, why is that important? It's because the Bible says, and John's Gospel says, that he was buried outside of the city. But just 10 years later, the tomb that he was actually buried in became inside the city. And so what that means is that if people 50 or 100 years later were just making up the site of the tomb, they would have read the Bible and read that it said he was buried outside of the city. And they would have picked a spot outside of the city and said that this was Jesus's tomb. But they didn't do so. They picked a spot inside the city, even though they knew the Bible said it was outside of the city. Now, that's not because they didn't read the Bible. It's not because they weren't aware of what the scripture taught. It's because they had a genuine historical recollection and testimony that this really was where Jesus was buried. And so that is one of the most compelling pieces of evidence to many scholars that this really is the tomb where Jesus was buried. Next slide, please. We're going to finally cover a little bit about the customs. So as I say, there's virtually no debate about the overwhelming majority of places in the Gospels. We found them through archaeology, and you can go and visit them today. There's also debate about whether the New Testament explains and accurately portrays the customs and the politics of the time. So Robert Price, a very skeptical writer, says that one of the major reasons the New Testament is wrong is because it says that Jesus taught in synagogues in Galilee. But he says there were no synagogues in Galilee at the time of Jesus. They only went to Galilee after the fall of Jerusalem and much later on. Well, again, archaeology has shown this to be wrong. We know that there are synagogues from the first century, from the time of Jesus, in Galilee. And here are just two examples. One is from Capernaum at the top left, and the bottom right is from Magdala, the town where Mary Magdalene would have been from. And both of these are from the first century and from the time of Jesus. A second really remarkable way that the New Testament accurately portrays the politics and the customs of the time is to talk about the titles of people. Now, if you think about it this way, if you were asked to say, what is the leader of another country? So suppose you were asked, what is the leader of Trinidad and Tobago? Is it the president or the prime minister or something else, and then you were asked about a whole load of other countries, St. Vincent and the Grenadines, St. Kitts and Nevis, Austria, Germany, Canada, you probably would get some of them wrong. And that's nothing to be embarrassed about. I probably would as well. And I've often made the mistake of calling someone a president when they're the prime minister and so on. Well, that's in a time where we have Google readily available, usually in our pocket. In the New Testament, of course, they didn't have access to such knowledge or such encyclopedias, and certainly not to the internet. So what's most remarkable is that they consistently get these titles right for lands that were across massive distances across the sea. So when you look at Paul's journeys in the book of Acts, he goes to many different places. And what they found is that every single time Luke records him as meeting a particular person, he gets the title right. So he's not making up these meetings. So in Cyprus, the leader was called the Antipatos, the proconsul. In Philippi, the magistrates were called strategoi, or governors. In Thessaloniki, the leaders were called politarchai, or rulers. In Ephesus, the leader was called a grammateus, from which we get the word grammar, a town clerk. And the ruler of Malta is just called a protos. If you think proto or prototype, it means first. So it just means the first person in Malta. And archaeology has shown that every single time they mention a ruler's title, they get it right, without access to the internet and so on. And this is really strong evidence that they had genuinely been on these journeys and recorded them in painstaking detail. And these are not just isolated examples. The historian Colonial has actually identified over 200 specific facts just from the last 16 chapters of Acts, all of which have been confirmed to be true by archaeology and external historical sources. Next slide, please. So A.N. Sherwin-White, who was a professor of Roman and classical studies at the University of Oxford, put it very clearly, even 60 years ago now. He said, for Acts, the confirmation of historicity is overwhelming. Any attempt to reject its basic historicity, even in matters of detail, must now appear absurd. Roman historians, not biblical scholars, not pastors, Roman historians have long taken for granted the basic historicity of Acts. Next slide, please. And so finally, before we have a short time of Q&A and then hear from Max, there is a passage in the book of Mark where Sadducees come to Jesus and they say there is no resurrection, and they try to trick him out by trying to give him a scenario about the resurrection, trying to show that it's a ridiculous idea. Now, what Jesus does here is interesting, because if you were in the first century in Judaism and you were asked to prove the resurrection, you would probably go to a book like Ezekiel, which talks about the valley of dry bones being resurrected. Or you might talk about Daniel and the resurrection themes in the book of Daniel. You might talk about some of the literature from the Jewish period outside of the Hebrew scriptures. But Jesus doesn't point to any of these obvious kind of demonstrations of the resurrection from the Hebrew scriptures. He actually points to a quite obscure demonstration of the resurrection, which doesn't explicitly mention it. He says, haven't you read in the book of Moses that God spoke to him saying, I am the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob? And Jesus concludes, he is not the God of the dead, but the God of the living. Now, this passage in Genesis or Exodus doesn't really seem to explicitly talk about resurrection at all. But Jesus uses it. And the reason is this: it's because the Sadducees didn't believe that the other books of the Old Testament were authoritative. The Sadducees only believed that the 5 books of Moses had authority. Now, Mark doesn't kind of put this kind of answer in. Obviously, he doesn't explain it. He doesn't kind of try to show off his knowledge about the Sadducees. He just implicitly assumes it, showing that he has a implicit understanding of what the Sadducees really believed. And this is particularly remarkable because the Sadducees completely disappeared from history just a few decades after Jesus's life. And so if someone were just making this up decades later, there's no way that they would understand so casually and so instinctively what the Sadducees actually believed. Now, there's a huge amount more that could be said about that, but I'd love to take some time for some questions and answers. As I've suggested, so far we've just covered the places and the customs and the politics. That doesn't necessarily show that the characters are real. It doesn't necessarily show that the events are real. My colleague Max is going to be talking about that afterwards, but we'd love to take some questions now about anything that's been presented so far or anything else relating to the reliability of the Bible. We'd love to try and answer those questions. So thank you for your patience so far.
Thank you, Dr. Miller. Really appreciate your presentation. So I just wanted, before we open up the Q&A, just to give a little comment. So just to think how we are easy to trust secular history, but based on what you've presented today, there is so much preservation and the timeline of the records. There is far more credible basis to also trust the New Testament if you're going to trust secular records. One of the interesting things that you also mentioned was that many of these findings were not done by persons actually sympathetic to the Christian faith. So I have read of the story of archaeologist Sir William Ramsay, for example. He was actually a skeptic and he went to Asia Minor to actually try to prove that the Bible was inaccurate historically. And he actually wrote a few books. One is St. Paul the Traveler and the Roman Citizen, if you wanted to look it up, if you're watching us now. But he actually was recorded to say, "I began with a mind unfavorable to it. But more recently, I found myself brought into contact with the Book of Acts as an authority for the topography, antiquities, and society of Asia Minor. It was gradually borne upon me that in various details, the narrative showed marvelous truth." And he actually called Luke as a historian of the first rank. So, this was a skeptic trying to prove that Christianity was not credible. But, just want to open up the floor to anyone who has any questions. If you have, come across anything else that you wanted clarification for. Okay, I see a hand from Mr. Smith, Zachary Smith. You may unmute yourself. Let me see if I can mute.
Everyone.
Good evening.
So I understand that based on how the information was recorded back then, it seems as if the reason that most, people today have an issue with believing in, the scriptures and their accuracy, is because it was a difference of evidence or difference of recording. Sorry, it was a difference in bringing forth evidence back then. So, say for instance, what would you agree in terms of that sense? Say for instance, more in that back in those days, people could, because they didn't really have any much distractions besides from buildings, really and truly, and animals and persons that they have around them, they could accurately say that they witnessed something. Other than in today's society, when you have media and people are more placed to the side of having a certain narrative or agenda when it comes on to witnessing or eyewitness. It's more credible to have a form of technology that provides evidence through DNA or through anything else. So would you say that it because it's a change in times that it is harder to believe in evidence presented in the gospel?
I think what I'd say, thank you for your question. The first thing I'd say is that we do know that in cultures where there is a lot lower literacy, they have a lot more of a focus on oral history and remembering things. And so the kind of memory capacity of people who work in oral cultures and cultures where not many people can read and write is actually enormous. And that makes a huge difference because, at least in the very early stages, some of what eventually went through to Luke when he was writing his gospel would have been remembered by eyewitnesses and maybe passed on to another witness or whoever, and then relayed to Luke. Now, sometimes people probably would have documented exactly what Jesus said at the time. In other cases, they remembered it. And we do know that in different cultures where there is more of an oral tradition and less of a written tradition, the capacity for remembering things in great detail is much, much higher. And so that makes a big difference. And it's one of the reasons that even in the cases where the New Testament relies on an oral tradition, we can trust that oral tradition, that it is ultimately reliable. And part of this is because they would have spent a lot of time sharing stories. When you don't have Instagram or whatever young people do these days, I don't know. When you have less of those distractions, and in more traditional cultures, one of the key means of entertainment was telling stories to each other. And they would tell stories in groups, and all of the groups would eventually know the story, and they would be able to correct people who made a mistake when they were telling those stories. So we know quite a lot about the dynamics of these sorts of very ancient traditional cultures and how they can reliably transmit information and reliably remember it. And part of that is because their societies were based around speaking to each other, remembering things, and telling stories. And that's, the bulk of the Gospels is about stories about Jesus. That's not saying they're not true. They're true stories. So absolutely, I would say that there are differences between ancient and modern people in terms of their kind of emphases and what they're interested in and how they're able to remember things. And actually, it means that in the ancient world, they're in many cases a lot more able to reliably transmit information compared to our modern culture, where unless we write it down on our phone, we're probably going to forget it. So I think that makes a big difference. I hope I've understood your question correctly, but please let me know if I haven't.
Yes, yes, you answered it.
All right, thank you for the question. So is there any other question? Anyone else has any comments, or even if you're, a skeptic, we are willing to hear your questions. That's why we have this forum. All right, so since no one is actually volunteering, let me come with a question that has actually been sparked from a movie that came out a few years back, The Gift of the Da Vinci Code. Dr. Miller, I'm not sure how familiar you are with that movie, but it's basically depicted the New Testament as being basically a conspiracy, where Constantine was said to be the one that developed the Bible, and having 80 gospels and some of the gospels being burnt, etc. You did present a lot on the preservation and the timelines, but could you comment on some of the claims that this movie had depicted on the New Testament, and what is credible and what is not credible based on what they have said?
Yeah, thank you for that. I'm not able to say a huge amount because I haven't seen the movie. But the first thing I would say is that this is ultimately a work of fiction. And when you look at what New Testament historians, and when I say New Testament historians, I don't mean religious scholars. I mean historians from any religion, from no religion, all of whom study the New Testament from a historical perspective. I think it's fair to say that none of them would agree with the kind of more controversial claims in the Da Vinci Code about conspiracies and about Constantine in the 4th century just making up the books to be in the Bible. One of the claims that comes up in this is about these kind of lost gospels, these so-called gospels which should have been in the New Testament but aren't. In fact, scholars are agreed that the 4 gospels we have in the New Testament are by a long way the earliest gospels in existence. So when you look at these other gospels, it's not that they were being suppressed or hidden. Everyone has always known about them and people have always written about them. No one has ever been trying to hide them. The reason they weren't taken seriously is because they were written much, much later by people who had very little to do with Jesus or his followers and had no reliable historical tradition in them. And there's a universal consensus among scholars, really, that these gospels are later, with very few exceptions. So that's one of the main things I'd say, but possibly Max wants to add something as well.
Yeah, I think Callum's mostly covered it. I mean, I think the thing that's important to kind of understand is that it's not the reason that historians give priority to Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John is not because Christians think they're scripture. Because they're the only biographical documents we have about Jesus that are close in time to the events. Whereas, the other ones, I mean, the Gospel of Thomas is slightly debated, but all of the others are undoubtedly much, much later and can't possibly be dependent on eyewitness testimony. And a final point to make is just that, and we can actually see the fruit of that in the content of the Gospels, which, as Callum was explaining, have tons of minor details about landmarks, geography, customs, and so on. And many of these small details have been verified. And the non-canonical Gospels, the apocryphal Gospels, mostly don't really even try to get details of that sort right. But where they do, they make some really bad mistakes. And so, they're just on purely historical grounds, completely ignoring the fact that Christians treat Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John as scripture and not the other ones. It has nothing to do with that. On purely historical grounds, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John are just much, much better, have a much, much better claim to being based on authentic memories of Jesus than the other Gospels.
All right, thank you so much for your explanations. We're going to have just one more opening if anyone else wanted to have a quick question before our second segment. All right, I see a question. Dalkeith, you may unmute your mic.
All right, good afternoon, everyone.
Good afternoon.
I guess I'm asking the presenters from their perspective, when do you think the Gospels are dated? We know that secular scholars date them extremely late, majorly because the assumption that Jesus cannot predict the future and stuff like that. But when would you date the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John?
Yeah, so I think I'm not personally certain of this, and it's not something that kind of the Bible kind of has a position on. The Bible doesn't say this book was written early on. And the first thing I'd say is that even if they were written late, and we do know that John was probably written somewhat late because the early church tradition afterwards said that John wrote it in his old age. So we know that it probably wasn't written straight away. Even if they were written late, we know that they were reliable because of the evidence. And actually, it's more impressive if they were written late, that they get all of these things right. So, for example, if the Gospel of John was written in 90 AD, which is quite a late dating, it's amazing that he gets so many specific details right, because the land of Israel, and Jerusalem in particular, was completely destroyed in 70 AD. And so he couldn't just go around to Israel in 90 AD and just find the landmarks and understand them and write about them, because they wouldn't be there. So I would say even if they are dated late, that doesn't undermine their accuracy. And in some ways, it might enhance their accuracy. As it happens, I don't necessarily think they were dated late. I think there are powerful arguments that some of the Gospels were written pretty early. One of the most powerful arguments, in my view, is that the Gospel of Luke, Luke and Acts together don't document what happened to St. Paul in the 60s. And this seems like a strange omission, given that Paul was such a centerpiece of the book of Acts. And in my view, that's quite good evidence that Acts was written before Paul died and before there was an answer to what happened to Paul, which would have been in the 60s or early 60s, and Luke would have been written before that. And since Luke likely used Mark as a source, as Luke says in the beginning of his gospel, I consulted eyewitnesses and sources and things. Luke tells us that he used sources. Mark would have been written even earlier. Now, some people might disagree with that. It's quite possible Max might disagree with that. I won't speak for him. But I would say, even if the Gospels are written late, they're still demonstrably historically accurate, even despite the destruction of Israel in the meantime. But there are actually pretty good arguments, and that's not the only one. There are other arguments as well. There are other arguments for thinking that they were written much earlier than skeptical scholars would typically put them. But I don't think it makes an enormous difference, because I think we can show that they're reliable either way.
All right, very, very good answer. I see a hand by Mr. Buckland. You can just maybe put in a minute. I think you're going to be addressing the same question briefly.
Okay, good night. Yes, I believe that there is internal evidence that the Gospels were written close in time to the events that they describe. Beginning with the Gospel of Matthew, we know that the purpose of Matthew's Gospel was to convince Jewish readers that Jesus is the Messiah for the Jewish people. And since that is the case, it could have been written before the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem in AD 70, and before the Jewish people were exiled into other parts of the Roman Empire. Mark was written by John Mark, who was a convert of the Apostle Peter, and Peter died in AD 68 during the reign of Nero, and therefore the Gospel of Mark had to be written before Peter's death. Luke, he got his information from the 12 apostles, and this, I believe, happened during the time that Luke was with Paul in Jerusalem during a 2-year period, as recorded in the latter chapters of Acts, in which he could have gotten information from the 12 apostles that were there and from Mary, the mother of Jesus, who was being looked after by John. So that would put Luke between AD 58 and AD 60. John, as was mentioned, was written late, but it could not have been written later than AD 100, because that was the time that Eusebius records that John died in the reign of the Emperor Trajan. So it must have been written earlier than that. Now, remember that before the Gospels were even written, they were being circulated by word of mouth, by preaching on a daily basis. And also, the epistles, many of them were written earlier than the Gospels. And for example, Paul wrote 1 Corinthians around AD 57, about 27 years after the death of Jesus and his resurrection. And at that time, he said in 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verse 6, that Jesus appeared to over 500 brethren at one time, and most of them are still alive, that could verify what he had said about the resurrection. A lot more to be said, but I know that the speakers from the United Kingdom need to continue their presentation.
All right. Wow. So many things to discuss today. I know that we're all buzzing with our questions, but we will have one more section for questions and answers. Just another, again, for those who came late, a key takeaway of what we had seen before was that many of the archaeological findings were done by persons who were actually skeptical of Christianity, went to try to disprove Christianity, and then they found that, wow, this is actually really recording. These places are real, they're not made up. So Dr. Max is our next presenter. And I was supposed to share the screen, but let me just read it. So Dr. Max Baker Hitch received his PhD in philosophy from Oxford University. He teaches at OCCA, the Oxford Center for Christian Apologetics. He is also a lecturer in philosophy at Wycliffe Hall, Oxford University, and is a member of the philosophy faculty at Oxford University. Max speaks and writes at both academic and popular levels on a range of topics related to the intellectual credibility of the Christian worldview. So welcome again, Dr. Max. We look forward for your second half of the presentation.
Thank you very much. Yeah, so picking up where Callum left off, if you remember that diagram we had earlier with the sort of concentric circles, so Callum's given a flavor of the evidence for the authenticity of the world that the Gospels portray. So now turning to the evidence that the people in the Gospels are real. So we can start by considering some of the characters that you might expect would be mentioned outside of the New Testament. And the Jewish historian Flavius Josephus wrote a kind of chronicle of the land of Israel up until the end of the 1st century. Josephus's work is a really important text for kind of background understanding of the land of Israel during the time in which Jesus lived and ministered. And Josephus does mention a number of public figures, and in some cases, figures actually who you might not expect to be mentioned outside the New Testament. But so he mentions Jesus, as we'll discuss in a bit more depth later, John the Baptist, the Herod family, Caiaphas the high priest, Pontius Pilate, and James, the brother of Jesus. Now, as for Jesus himself, and I guess Callum sort of made this point earlier, but there really is no serious doubt among historians that Jesus really existed. And one way to kind of bring out the kind of strength of the evidence for Jesus is to consider that many important figures of the Roman period are only attested by a handful of literary sources. I mean, and actually, when you think about some of the figures in the New Testament, or some of the figures around Jesus' time, like, for example, King Herod the Great, is really mentioned in not very many sources at all, not very many literary sources, but there's no doubt that he was a real person and that we can kind of know quite a bit about what he was like. Jesus, by contrast, is mentioned by at least 13 different ancient sources, including at least 6 non-Christian sources. So Bart Ehrman, who's someone you may have heard of, definitely on the much more liberal, skeptical end of the spectrum of scholarship, but still he nonetheless says that no serious historian doubts the existence of Jesus. We have more evidence for Jesus than for almost anyone of his time period. Now, you'll notice that when you read the Gospels, there are quite a number of minor characters, and some of them might just crop up, just once or twice. And so you might wonder, well, okay, so grant that Jesus was real, that, the high priest Caiaphas was real, John the Baptist, and so on. But what about all these many other characters? Couldn't it just be the case that the gospel authors were sort of, inventing characters with realistic sounding names to sort of pad out their stories and make them feel more real? Well, there's a really interesting discovery that's been made in the last few years, which is that the patterns of the names, and specifically kind of the relative proportions in terms of what percentage of people in the population had a given name, actually matches really strikingly well with the percentages that we find in the New Testament. And so archaeologists have built up a database of about 3,000 names of real people who lived and died a century either side of Jesus. And naming patterns were quite stable then. They didn't really change very much over the decades. And one of the main sources of this database is inscriptions on the sides of tombs. So as I said, archaeologists have built up a database of about 3,000 names of real people who lived and died around the time of Jesus. And from that, they're able to get some really good data about how popular different names were. And so a test that we can do is to say, for instance, how, what percentage of men in this archaeologist database were called Simon. And we can compare that with the percentage of men in the New Testament who have the name Simon. I'm not going to read out these numbers, but you can see for yourself that the match is really quite striking. And there's just no way that the gospel authors could have manufactured this to create an impression for historians 2,000 years later of authenticity. I mean, for one thing, it would not have occurred to them that historians would be able to do this kind of test in hundreds of years hence. But the other thing is they would not have had the kind of survey data that would enable them to get these matches. And okay, you might think, well, still they, if they were familiar with this time and place, they could sort of make educated guesses about what names were popular. And to an extent, yes, maybe they would have known that Simon was a common name and that, let's say, Matthew was a rarer name, but there's no way that they would have been able to get the percentages anything like this close. And so what this tells us is, again, something really important about the quality of the information that the gospel authors had available to them. And so what this tells us is that the gospel authors cannot have been sort of at the far end of a sort of process of something like the telephone game, as Bart Ehrman tries to characterize it, where the stories would have been passed along many links in a chain of testimony, and they could have got sort of increasingly distorted along the way. A process like that would never have produced something like this result, where the names of minor people are being accurately preserved. And in fact, studies in psychology have shown that when people are telling stories and passing them on, small details like the names of minor characters or place names are among the first things to be forgotten or garbled. So this is very strong evidence that the process by which the Gospels came into being was not a sort of telephone game style scenario. Rather, the evidence strongly points to the Gospel authors having been very close to the eyewitnesses and the eyewitnesses having preserved even small details reliably. And this is just to further the point about the names. In first century Palestine, there were, they didn't use surnames in the way that we do. And they had various methods for distinguishing between people with common names. And some of them are listed there. I won't read them all out. And the thing that's striking is that in the archaeologist database, we can observe different ways that they use to distinguish people with common names. And in the New Testament, we find those very same methods of distinguishing people with common names, whether it's a father's name or name of a husband, nickname, hometown, occupation, and so on. And the other thing is that's important too is that we find these kinds of epithets, as they're known, things like son of John, only after what are in fact the common names, and the rare names, things like Bartimaeus, don't need any such epithets, and we don't find them when attached to those characters. So again, just further evidence of the authenticity of these personal names in the Gospels. And this is Professor Richard Borkham, who wrote the kind of landmark book, Jesus and the Eyewitnesses, which had a significant impact on the field of New Testament studies, where he just makes the point that these naming patterns it's not something that the gospel authors could have produced as a result of randomly inventing names. And that's even underscored more when you consider that there's a good case for thinking, for example, that the Gospel of Mark was written in Rome. And that's what the tradition says, and that fits with the fact that Peter spent the latter part of his life in Rome, and Mark was a friend of Peter. And so the point is just that the naming patterns that Jews in Rome, in the diaspora outside of Israel, were using were very different from the naming patterns of Palestinian Jews. Okay, so let's turn now to thinking about the evidence for the events themselves. We've looked at least try to give you a flavor of the evidence for the authenticity of the world in which the Gospels are set, and additionally the people. Now let's turn to consider some of the evidence for the events themselves. And now, actually, just want to pause there to say that already the fact that the Gospels have so many indications of authentically reflecting the world in which they're set, already that actually would give a historian a significant amount of confidence that the Gospels are going to accurately report the events that they describe. Because the sort of like historical fiction set in real places, but where the events are completely made up, that's not a genre that existed in that way in the first century. And so already the fact that the Gospels are reflecting such extensive aspects of what the world of Jesus was like in authentic detail already is a big indicator that they are going to be historically reliable when they report events. There are several ancient non-Christian sources which corroborate at least the outlines of the events, not in huge detail, but insofar as they do tell us about the events, the same events as the New Testament reports, they completely fit with what the New Testament says. So here's Josephus again. Now, it's important to say that this passage is widely thought by historians to have been slightly touched up by a Christian scribe who maybe felt that certain parts of it weren't reverent enough about Jesus. But the thing is that the Christian scribe has evidently been quite clumsy in the way that they've tried to improve the passage. And so most historians would agree that it is possible to, with a reasonable degree of confidence, to work out which bits were added by a Christian scribe and which bits were original to Josephus. And so we've put in brackets the bits that are thought to have been added by a Christian scribe, and I won't read them out now, but the passage that probably Josephus wrote went something like this: that now there was about this time Jesus, a wise man, for he was a doer of surprising works, a teacher of such men as receive the truth with pleasure. He drew over to himself both many of the Jews and many of the Gentiles. And when Pilate, at the suggestion of the principal men amongst us, had condemned him to the cross, those that loved him at the first did not forsake him, for they reported that he appeared alive to them. And the tribe of Christians, so named from him, are not extinct at this day. Now, there's a later passage in Josephus that also briefly mentions Jesus again, in the context of talking about the stoning to death of Jesus's brother James. Let's move on to look briefly at Tacitus, who was a Roman senator writing early in the 2nd century. And the context for this passage is that there was a fairly brutal persecution by the Christians in around 64 AD, where basically Nero made a scapegoat out of the Christians to deflect blame from himself for a huge fire that had happened in Rome. And Tacitus is describing this episode, and by way of sort of background, explaining who these Christians are, Tacitus has a brief mention of Jesus, and he says, Christus, from whom the name Christian had its origin, suffered the extreme penalty, and that's crucifixion, during the reign of Tiberius at the hands of one of our procurators, Pontius Pilate. And he goes on to talk about how a most mischievous superstition, thus checked for the moment, again broke out not only in Judea, that's the province where Jerusalem is, the first source of the evil, but even in Rome. And he goes on to describe some of the ways in which Christians were rounded up and treated brutally and executed. A third ancient source is Pliny the Younger, again a Roman. He was a governor of a province called Bithynia, which is in modern day geography Turkey, and he was writing to the emperor of his day, the Emperor Trajan, to basically express his concerns about how quickly Christianity was growing in his province, and it was causing a number of problems from his point of view, including the fact that the pagan temples were kind of losing out economically. And anyway, in the course of expressing his concerns, he describes some of the behaviors of these Christians. And he says that the Christians were in the habit of meeting on a certain fixed day before it was light, when they sang in alternate verses a hymn to Christ as to a God. And he goes on to describe some of their other kind of behavior. So this is really quite significant, because if you just imagine for a moment that we didn't have the New Testament documents, just from these three non-Christian sources, we could piece together quite a significant amount of information about Jesus. So we could know that he was known as a moral teacher and wise man, that his followers believed him to be the Christ, that's to say the Jewish Messiah. You could know that they thought he was a miracle worker. Josephus referenced to his surprising deeds. We'd know about his death by crucifixion, and that it was carried out at Pontius Pilate's instruction, and with some kind of involvement from the Jewish chief priests during the Passover. We'd know about the fact that the movement he founded stopped temporarily after his death, but then quickly got going again, which is quite interesting and seems to call out for some sort of explanation, which Christians, of course, would claim was Jesus' resurrection. And we'd also know about Jesus' brother James and his execution. We'd know about the rapid spread of Christianity throughout the Roman Empire, and about the violent persecution that happened under Nero, and also about this custom they had of meeting together on a fixed day, that would be Sunday, to worship Jesus together. So again, this is important as well, because, you know, contrary to sort of Da Vinci Code conspiracy theories claiming that, you know, the Council of Nicaea invented Jesus' divinity in the 4th century, this is some evidence from early in the 2nd century, pointing to the fact that Christians had this well-established custom already of meeting together to worship Jesus as divine. Okay, I'm nearly ready to wrap up, but let's just consider a couple of other lines of evidence for the reliability of the New Testament, or one further line of evidence. And so we've considered the fact that actually there are several non-Christian ancient sources which corroborate the outlines of the Jesus story. We've talked about the fact that the Gospels have all sorts of corroboration of minor details, which gives us this sense that they are really well plugged into the time and place that they're talking about. Here's another thing that's really important, and it's the fact that Paul is actually an independent source of information about Jesus' life, separate completely from the gospel authors. No modern scholar thinks that you know, the gospel authors were basing their accounts on Paul's letters. Paul's letters wouldn't have been widely circulated at that point. And so Paul, the reason Paul's letters are so important is that they're, relatively speaking, so very early. So 20 to 30 years after, and remember, you know, Alexander the Great, earliest biography that we have today, by earliest biographical source, 120 years afterwards. So you compare that to 20 to 30 years after for Paul's letters. And all historians, even the most liberal ones, like Bart Ehrman, agree that Paul knew some of the eyewitnesses, like Jesus' brother James and Jesus' head disciple Peter. So Paul and Paul tells us this in Galatians 1 verse 18, which and that's Galatians is a letter that all modern historians think Paul really wrote. And Paul tells us there that he spent a couple of weeks with Peter. And actually the Greek word that's used there basically means to go up and investigate something. So Paul tells us himself that he met with Peter in order to kind of learn and verify things for himself. So he certainly had plenty of opportunities to interact with the best eyewitnesses that there were. And a final point in terms of why Paul's letters are so significant is that the remarks that he makes about Jesus' life are just very kind of casual, in passing, throwaway remarks, where it's really clear he's not kind of trying to show off how much he knows about Jesus. If anything, it's the opposite. And it's what that tells us is that Paul expects the audience he's writing to, he actually expects them to know this stuff, and it kind of implies that there's a much bigger body of information that Paul has given them about Jesus, and he's just touching on a few little sort of tips of the iceberg. So this is actually a really important line of evidence for the outline of the story of Jesus in the Gospels, and in a bit more depth than we can corroborate just from the non-Christian sources. So if you do another sort of thought experiment in which we don't have the Gospels, but we do have Paul's letters, we could know all of the following things about Jesus. We could know that he was Jewish because he was born of a Jewish woman, that he was a direct descendant of King David. He had several brothers. One was called James. We could know about this group, the 12, and that Peter had a particularly special role. And we'd know that his ministry focused on Israel rather than the Gentiles, that he summarized his ethical teaching as love for one another, that he claimed that he would return in glory, and that his return would be come at an unexpected time, like a thief in the night. If you remember that, there's a parable Jesus tells about a thief coming in the night. And Paul also uses that same imagery. We'd know his followers believed he was the Christ, the Messiah. We know about his Last Supper with them, where he spoke of bread and wine as his body and blood, and that he was betrayed on that night. We know that his crucifixion happened at the hands of the Romans, but that also the Jewish authorities were somehow involved. We know that he was buried rather than being left to the elements. We know that, or at least the earliest Christians believed, that he was resurrected on the third day, and that he appeared to many of them, including Peter, James, and Paul. And we'd know that his earliest followers would refer to him as the Lord, where this title, the Lord, or Kyrios, in the particular way they're using it is clearly the same way that the Greek translation of the Old Testament, known as the Septuagint, uses that as a title for God. So we'd know that his earliest followers were thinking of Jesus as in some sense coextensive with the one God of Israel. Okay, so just wrapping things up then, to bring this into land, we've tried to make the case that the historical narratives of the New Testament are basically accurate. And if that's the case, then we need to take very seriously Jesus' claims about himself and the claims about his resurrection.
Okay, thank you so much, Dr. Max. That was so much that you had actually squeezed into the short time frame that we have here. We are now into our final Q&A, but let me just lead with a question that was actually on YouTube by Brittany. So Brittany asks, do you find that there is more skepticism of the Bible among secular Christian or Jewish scholars? My understanding is that the truth of the Old Testament is boosted by the reliability of the New Testament. So based on your research and knowledge, do you find that the skepticism is more among secular Christian or Jewish scholars?
It's funny to be, well, I mean, I think some of the most skeptical biblical scholars are liberal Christians. Actually, so there are a number of Jewish New Testament scholars, and perhaps it's because they see just how Jewish the New Testament is and the Gospels, and just how well it fits with the Judaism of Jesus' day. It's interesting that, which is not to say, Jewish scholars who study the New Testament think it's perfectly reliable, but the ones that I've read do tend to at least credit it as a serious historical source on a par with other historical sources from that period that they would take seriously. As I said, if I'm honest, I think some of the most skeptical scholars are liberal Christians, and I can't help wondering if the reason for that is that they're, on some level, they feel that they have to prove that they're not biased by being excessively skeptical in their conclusions. I don't know if Callum wants to add anything.
I don't think I have anything particular to add there. I think I'm broadly in agreement with that.
Yeah, so I find it really interesting that, even secular scholars, they don't doubt the historicity, basically based on just the evidence is just so overwhelming. And, unfortunately, some Christians who are in academia, they tend to, feel that if they profess their faith publicly, they are going to be looked at as biased. So it's so ironic. It is very ironic, but I think it actually does speak to that there is credibility to actually be taken seriously if the seculars are the ones who actually realize and will admit that the Bible is historical. All right, so I won't bother to speak much more. I know that we have people here that might want to say something. Is there any other question that anyone else has? Or comment? I did get a question from Renee. Renee asked, is it true that Paul was taught by Jesus himself for 3 years?
We don't have any evidence that suggests that. So Paul grew up in Tarsus, which was a city in the province of Cilicia in the Roman Empire. But it's clear that he also, he tells us himself, or at least Luke does in Acts, and Luke was a traveling companion of Paul, that Paul studied under Rabbi Gamaliel in Jerusalem. So, and of course we know that Paul was in Jerusalem when the Christian movement was getting started, and Paul was at first strongly opposed to it. So all that to say, Paul was in Jerusalem, during the 3 years that Jesus had his public ministry. That's really all we can say with any confidence. We just have no idea whether Jesus and Paul interacted in person, or whether Paul was in a crowd when Jesus was teaching in the temples. It's possible. We just have no direct historical evidence one way or the other.
Okay, all right. Before we go to Pastor Buckland, whose hand is up, I wanted to ask a question because I get asked this several times, even on campus. All right, so if we believe that the Bible is reliable and inerrant, there should not be contradictions in there. But you'll see certain sections in the New Testament that will speak about, for example, one angel appearing to someone, and then the other gospel says 2 angels were there. Can you just speak about contradictions? Are there contradictions in the New Testament, and how will that impact our faith?
I can say a bit, and Callum might want to add something. We actually have prepared a couple of slides on this because it is one of the questions that comes up the most. So I think one thing to say is that it's actually, almost expected that when you have two or more independent accounts talking about the same events, you will have minor details that differ from one another and that might even appear to contradict, even if in reality there isn't actually a contradiction. Because when you have multiple perspectives, you have different emphases and so on. And so, yeah, it is actually what you expect. And the fact that there are the appearances of tensions at some points actually bolsters the sense that there are genuinely multiple independent witness perspectives on these events. So that's one thing to say, but we can say a bit more than that. So yeah, just to take one example, and let's give a different example. The women at the empty tomb. This is one that's commonly brought up. So how many women were at the tomb and which ones? Because it seems like the different gospels say different things. So Mark says Mary Magdalene and Mary, the mother of James and Salome. Matthew says Mary Magdalene and the other Mary. Luke says Mary Magdalene and Joanna and Mary, the mother of James and the other women. And John just says Mary Magdalene. So this looks like, on the face of it, a mess, basically. But actually, there's only a contradiction there if we make one key assumption that is completely false, which is that the assumption is that each author is giving an exhaustive list of all the women at the tomb. And actually, more generally in ancient literature, it's very common to sort of spotlight certain characters and to mention only a particular character who is of interest to the author. And it doesn't at all mean that the author is saying that no one else was present. So there's actually no reason to assume that the fact that John only mentions Mary Magdalene means that John is saying that no other women were there. And actually, just a few verses later, interestingly, when Mary's reporting the fact that she went to the tomb and Jesus, Jesus' body wasn't there, she says that we couldn't find him. And that's interesting because that implies that there were others with her. And so that confirms for us that, John didn't feel that he had to mention all the other women who were there, even though he knew that there were. So that's just, one example of a way in which a sort of rigid and uncharitable reading could make it look like there's a contradiction here, but actually on closer inspection there isn't really a contradiction there when we kind of have a clearer understanding of the ways in which ancient authors worked.
Right.
This is just a modern, well, not really modern, but it's a more recent example of an apparent contradiction that wasn't one. So who made the public proclamation of the Declaration of Independence, the American Declaration of Independence, from the balcony of the old State House in Boston on the morning of July 18th, 1776? Okay, so some sources say it was William Greenleaf. Other sources say it was Colonel Thomas Crafts. So that looks like a contradiction, right? It can't be the case, it can't both be true. Well, actually, they can both be true because both of them did, in fact, read the declaration, but one of them had a weak voice. And so the other one with a stronger voice repeated it so that the crowd could hear. So this again just brings out the fact that we often, as readers, make assumptions which make it look like there's a contradiction, but actually those assumptions are not well founded. And if we get rid of them, we can see that there isn't really a contradiction there.
All right, excellent answer, Dr. Max. I mean, we're almost out of time, but yeah, just to actually let it visualize what you said. Basically, we can think of the Bible as a jigsaw puzzle, you cannot see the full picture without looking at the other sections of it. So I know Pastor Buckland had his hand up for a while, and then we need to unveil this week's competition question where you can win resources and other prizes. So yeah, just 1 minute, please.
Sarah, in the interest of time, I would suggest that you can go on.
Okay, all right. Dr. Max, can you please unshare your screen? I need to share something, please. All right, thank you. All right. All right, so for those who did not catch that question, our question for this week is, how can we know that the New Testament is reliable? I think you actually got a wealth of information tonight. Again, how to enter, just record your 1 minute video to Facebook, or you can email christ.the.oneway@gmail.com. You could also email my email address for you who get my updates. Tag our ministry, Chosen to Glow Ministries, and add the hashtag #YouthForTruth, and caption your video with your name, your organization if applicable. So that's like a youth group or whatever organization you would want to also win a prize, and the question that you are answering. So this week's challenge is now will close on Tuesday, October 12th, God willing, at midday Jamaica time. Some persons asked me in the chat for resources. We are giving away among our prizes this week as Evidence That Demands a Verdict by Sean and Josh McDowell. This is an excellent resource. I mean, you will win and have access to other resources. So I encourage you to try and share with your friends. Again, just to also remind you, everyone who tries will also win a resource, and you will also have a chance to enter to win our grand prizes, which include tours by the Smithsonian Museum and gift cards. So just to conclude, let me just bring this up. So, right. Just to conclude with 2 Peter 1 verse 16, for we did not follow cleverly devised stories when we told you about the coming of our Lord Jesus Christ in power, but we were eyewitnesses of his majesty. Just want to say that, from what we've heard today, we're not just relying on the primary testimonies written, but we do have many reasons from outside the Bible to believe that the New Testament is reliable. For this week, we focused on how historical the Bible is, but apart from just historicity and human transmission, can we have evidence for the supernatural inspiration or authenticity of its supernatural claims? Next week, we will continue this series on the reliability of the Bible, and we will specifically explore the question, is there any evidence for the resurrection of Jesus? We encourage you to keep searching for the truth. And if you have any question about faith that you'd like addressed here, or if you'd like to learn any more about how to become a Christian, you can connect with us, as you would have seen, christ.the.oneway@gmail.com. And we encourage you again to please try out our competition and spread the word. Thanks again for joining us. I will just share this is the flyer for next week, and join us again next week. It's the same link, same ID number for all of them. So no need to sign up again. And looking forward to have you. Thanks again for taking the time from your busy schedule to join us today. So we will stay on if you have any further questions, but we will just pause recording now. But thanks also to Dr. Callum Miller and Dr. Max Baker Hitch for your time and your great information that you've given us. So we do appreciate your time and effort. And especially now it's after 1 a.m. So thanks for your sacrifices. You all and have a good evening.